Hi all, thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, Data Center Impacts in Nevada, Policy Solutions for Water and Energy Use. Our presenters today are myself, as well as my colleagues Emily Walsh and George Kavros. I am a clean energy policy advisor at Western Resource Advocates. Emily is our Nevada policy advisor, and George is the Nevada Clean Energy Manager and Senior Attorney. So before we get started, we'll just go over a couple of housekeeping things. You can use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded, and the recording will be sent to the email you registered with. So on the next slide, I'm just going to go over what we'll talk about today. So first off, I'll talk about why WRA is working on the topic of data centers, and then we'll have a discussion of the water and power impacts of data centers, some policy suggestions for navigating those water and power demands, and then my colleagues Emily and George will describe some of how this topic is playing out in Nevada. And lastly, we'll go over some policy solutions to the energy and water concerns brought up, including policies from other states. And at the end, we will have time for your questions that you can put in the Q&A throughout the webinar. So as you can see, there is quite a bit of data center resource use that is already occurring in the West. So looking at the water demands, and this is across all of WRA states, data centers are projected to use over 21,000 acre-feet of water annually by 2035, which is equivalent to the water use of nearly 200,000 people. And I will note that that calculation for data center water use is based on the average on-site water intensity of data centers and electric utilities' projected energy demands. And so the water projections are very reliant on nationally reported data about average data center water use, but individual data centers' water use varies greatly, and certain categories of data centers like hyperscale or extremely large data centers tend to have more water intensive use. And then moving to the graphic on the right, you can see that the electricity demands of data centers in the West, so that's in Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona, have spurred extremely high levels of projected growth, especially as compared to the past couple of decades in the electricity space, in which growth has been relatively flat, slow, and predictable. So utilities are now projected to have energy demands that are 32% higher in 2030 and 55% higher in 2035 relative to expected 2025 levels of demand that was projected. So over that decade of 2025 to 2035, that equates to a compound annual growth rate of 4.5%, which is really fast growth, especially for an electric sector that has typically seen growth rates of under 1% annually. And so this forecast is moving really, really quickly in this direction of growth. And even since the last time that WRA looked at resource plans from these utilities, we have seen these load projections accelerate even more. So I'm going to zoom in on the next slide to what this looks like in Nevada. So as you can see, looking at NV Energy, there are quite a few things that are going on with load growth that is spurred by data centers. So on the waterfront, there is an additional demand of 3,709 acre-feet annually starting in 2035, which is enough water to support approximately 22,000 individuals. So the water demands are not insignificant. And I'll also add that a lot of these water demands tend to be placed on the same watersheds, given that data centers are prone to clustering, in which many data centers will locate in geographic proximity to one another. So this can place a lot of acute stress on a particular water provider or watershed when that clustering occurs. I'll also note on the electricity side that overall for all of NV Energy's service territory, electricity demands will be 18% higher in 2030 and 34% higher in 2035 relative to just the 2022 IRP estimates. So we've seen these projections change quite a bit in just the past 2 to 3 years between IRP filing cycles. And in Nevada, as I mentioned on this clustering, most of the data center projections are located in the Northern Service Territory, Sierra Pacific. So if you look at Sierra Pacific specifically and not just NV Energy, those numbers are actually even more dramatic, and that the annual energy demand in that portion of the service territory is projected to increase by 64% from 2023 to 2030, and then to more than double from 2023 to 2045. So that would be essentially building out the Sierra Pacific service territory again over the next 20 years in terms of growth in electricity demand. So next, I'm going to talk a bit more about kind of why we're talking about water impacts with energy. And so as you can see here, data centers have this very intertwined relationship between water and electricity usage. And so water is used on site for data center cooling. Essentially, the computing equipment that is housed in data centers gets very hot while it is doing these computing activities, and water or air are used to cool these servers to ensure that they do not overheat and are at a proper temperature. But additionally, water is also used offsite for various types of power generation. Resources like coal and fossil gas frequently have evaporative cooling to ensure that those plants remain at an appropriate temperature for the generation of electricity. So when we look at how we're measuring the water intensity of data centers, one metric that is really helpful is something called water use efficiency. And that's measured in liters of water per kilowatt hour. And that water use efficiency when it comes to on-site data center cooling varies significantly based on the type of cooling technology deployed, the climate the data center is located in, as well as the design of the data center. So when we look at the national average on-site water intensity of data centers, that's 0.36 liters per kilowatt hour, also equal to 95 gallons per megawatt hour. And so that is something that's reliant on national data, but individual data centers' water use can vary very widely. So for example, a dry-cooled data center can have a pretty good water efficiency of 0.11 liters per kilowatt hour. But if you think about a hybrid wet and dry-cooled data center, that might have a water use efficiency of 6.47 liters per kilowatt hour, so significantly less efficient in terms of water use. So looking at these projections that are captured in this graphic, those are based on the additional electricity demand of data centers with the assumption that that demand would be met with combined cycle gas plants, which are rather water intensive. So you can see that actually quite a bit of the water impacts from data centers is not actually from the on-site cooling, but rather if that additional electricity demand is met with fossil resources that are extremely water intensive. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the water energy nexus on the next slide, and briefly to help folks contextualize this, I'll go over different types of cooling technologies that data centers use. So overall, data centers use an average of 40% of their electricity on their cooling systems. So not even on computing tasks, but rather on keeping those computing servers cool enough to perform those. So there are these explicit trade-offs between water and energy use for data centers. So on the left, we have refrigeration cooling. And so that essentially entails circulating cool air throughout the data center and removing hot air. And within refrigeration cooling, that can happen either through a compressor unit with cool air or through a water-cooled chiller. And water-cooled chillers are generally the most water-intensive type of cooling. Direct evaporative cooling is using water to cool the air that's circulated in the data center, and that's the equivalent of a residential swamp cooler that you might be familiar with in the household context. And I'll note that an important thing here is that some amount of water is being evaporated in these processes. And so that is consumptive water use as opposed to just kind of water demand. So when evaporative cooling is used, generally more than half of the water is evaporated off. And so that is a highly consumptive use of water. And then we also have free cooling systems, which utilizes natural features like cold outdoor air. And generally that's used in combination with another cooling system. This is kind of like when you open your windows on a beautiful fall day to get that lovely 60-degree air in your house. And then the last overarching type of cooling technology is liquid cooling, and that's using liquids which can be either water or a specialized liquid to directly cool the computing equipment instead of cooling the air around the computing equipment. So the way to kind of compare the water usage of these different cooling technologies is by that WUE metric. And so we have seen that hyperscalers actually generally have a significantly higher WUE score than data centers on average. So it's 1.22 liters per kilowatt hour for hyperscalers, as opposed to that 0.36 liters per kilowatt hour for all data centers. And so looking at this water use efficiency with the power use efficiency is a really helpful way to kind of understand and contextualize the resource use of data centers. And they have this inverse relationship where less water usage means that more electricity is needed for non-computing tasks because air instead of water is being used to cool the data center. So what all of this means is that there isn't necessarily one silver bullet solution for data centers and how to manage their on-site resource demands. Because it's really dependent on factors like water availability, where the data center is sited, and then also the generation mix of grid electricity, because it's possible that using a less water-intensive technology for cooling on site might actually mean an overall larger water footprint if additional water is used for resource generation for that electricity demand. So this is a really complicated question, and the answer to what is the best use of resources, water and electricity for data center design is something that is very dependent on the local situation. But I will present three foundational policies that we think are really important for navigating water demands. The first of which is consistent and transparent water use reporting. So right now, there's unfortunately very little publicly available information on water use from current data centers, as well as water use from expected data centers. There also is tension in some jurisdictions about whether and when water use projections from new and existing data centers should be made publicly available. And data center developers and local governments have sometimes entered into NDAs with details about data centers' water usage projections. So all of this illustrates that there is this clear gap in information collection and availability on this extremely important question of water use by these facilities. So to guide future decision making, especially on the state level, we think that it's really important to have data, at least on an annual basis, of data centers' total water use, their water use efficiency, as well as their peak use, because like a lot of other industries, data centers that are reliant on water tend to need more of that water in the summer when temperatures are hotter to cool their facilities. And so having all of this reported in a transparent and publicly accessible way is a foundational recommendation for navigating these water demands. The next piece of foundational policy for this is technical best management practices for on-site water management. So actually in Nevada, Southern Nevada Water Authority in the Vegas area is a leader on this topic, in that they have a moratorium on evaporative cooling for commercial and industrial uses for new customers. And then they also have several incentive programs that are aimed at moving customers in the commercial and industrial classes to different cooling technologies that are not as water consumptive. And so that was really a consideration that SNWA made based on local circumstances and water availability in that region. But beyond just restrictions on the type of cooling technology, some of the other technical best management practices for on-site water use for data centers can include things like looking at the water source. So deciding if perhaps data centers might have a limitation on the amount of potable water that they can use, or requiring them to use recycled water, as well as looking at requirements for the facility itself, like efficient design for airflow, which might require less water usage to cool the servers, as well as closed loop systems that can limit evaporative loss and thus make the water use less consumptive. And another example of this type of policy for these on-site water management rules is a community in Arizona, which explicitly does not allow for the provision of potable water to a data center for cooling or humidity control purposes. And then the last foundational policy bucket for navigating these water demands is large water user policies, which are what they sound like. Those are policies that are specifically aimed at users that have a certain threshold of water usage. And so we have actually seen municipalities, most notably Tucson in Arizona, have created large water user policies specifically in response to the demands posed by data centers. So in Tucson, after a proposed data center was actually rejected by the city council, they put forth a large water user policy where users have to submit an application that details how they will reduce their water consumption, showing that they can use at least 30% recycled water, either through the connection to the city's reclaimed water system or through on-site reuse. They also have to demonstrate consistency with the water master plan and the city's available water resources, and then provide proof that there is sufficient economic benefit to warrant such a large use of water per the applicant's projected use. So that really creates these additional guardrails and an additional burden of proof on the large water user before they are granted the ability to use that water. And I'll also note that this does create a different procedural track for large water users, where the applications by large water users have to be considered by both the Tucson mayor and the city council, so those projects receive additional scrutiny. Additionally, we've seen in Tempe, Arizona, in the Phoenix metro area, that data centers are classified as extreme water users per an ordinance. And so that requires them to submit a water use plan to the City Public Works Department for approval. Additionally, in Colorado, the city of Aurora simply does not allow for large water users to exceed certain volumetric and non-recoverable water use thresholds. So there are a variety of ways that municipalities and water utilities are kind of looking at the available water resources that they have, and making determinations that for certain large water users, they would like to see additional guardrails or less consumptive use of water in order to generally align with the resource availability, as well as the water planning and larger goals of where they are located and the customers they serve. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague to talk about some of the electricity demands in Nevada from data centers and how they have been playing out with the State Utility Commission.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. So I'm first going to talk about basically what has been happening in the past few years and what is happening in the near future with data centers. Basically, all of these impacts are here and now. We're beginning to see them, and they're not just in the far future. The continued load growth that we're seeing is not stopping. NV Energy first debuted their huge load forecast in the 2024 IRP, and this year we just got an update to their energy supply plan where they've already updated, in addition to 2026 and 2027, the outlook going forward. So when they update those load forecasts, especially in the energy supply plan, that means that they're having to buy power or buy resources in the near term to serve those, which is going to add to rates. Additionally, we're already seeing emissions impacts, specifically backsliding and even increased emissions, largely because of load growth in the state. In the next slide, I'll show exactly what those changes are. So as Deb kind of got into to meet data center needs in Northern Nevada, NV Energy is going to have to build more infrastructure than will serve all residential customers in Southern Nevada. This graph here shows the total, which are the solid lines for Nevada Power Company in orange, which is our southern subsidiary serving Las Vegas. And then the green line shows Sierra Pacific Power, which serves Reno and Northern Nevada. The green line is clearly seeing a increase, and that is purely attributed to the dashed green line, which is the major project, aka data center load. And as you can see at the end of the graph, it crosses the dotted orange line, which is the residential load of Southern Nevada. In the next 10 years, we are going to be serving again that load, and that is going to be an increase to the infrastructure in the area, as well as the costs that go along with it. Furthermore, by 2043, NV Energy's entire system, without regional breakouts for the South and North, will be providing more power to data centers than all residential customers combined in the state if these load forecasts ring true. And the thing is that since we're only 1 year out from the projections that led to this graph, and NV Energy is already adding more to those load forecasts, these dates may come even sooner. On the next slide, I'll also then talk about the emissions. So as I said, NV Energy is not only backsliding, but they are increasing their emissions. These are the emissions forecasts from the 2021 IRP, the Fifth Amendment to that IRP, which happened in 2023, and the 2024 IRP. The red arrow that I have at the top of the beginning of the graph shows the starting point for what the utility is projecting to emit. Because that arrow shows the trend line of those starting points going up, that means that emissions are actually increasing over the past 5 years. They're not following the path that they're expected to, and instead we're getting worse. Secondly, the red dots that are on the bottom of the line show when we are supposed to hit important emissions targets that are science-based. So in the 2021 IRP, we were supposed to hit that at about 2038. And then in the Fifth Amendment, that scooted back a little bit to about 2040. But now in the 2024 IRP, we're seeing delays up until 2046 or 2047. So that's almost an entire decade past our initial projections. Higher emissions lead to more air pollution in the state and increased temperatures with cascading effects such as drought. So the fact that we're already seeing these emissions go up right now in the past few years, and we haven't even seen the majority of this load growth come to fruition, is really concerning. So I will now go into basically on the next slide, the regulatory proceedings that are happening right now involving data centers. First is the Clean Transition Tariff. This is a really great opportunity for the state. Basically, NV Energy is creating a tariff or a structure that customers can take service under, which provides for giving them 100% clean energy at a price that is supposed to be, specific and removed from other customers in the state. This is being applied specifically right now to a 115 megawatt geothermal project that will serve Google's data centers. And then there are a few solar resources that are also being served or will maybe be served when they come online with this clean transition tariff. This clean transition tariff is for companies that have internal goals and they want to go beyond what is required for the state. This is not mandatory. So the companies that are participating in this, such as Google, are the ones driving it. And ultimately, if we want to see more data centers being powered with clean energy and not contributing to emissions, we might want to see more of that. Secondly, we have the upcoming Sierra Pacific Power rate case. Rate cases are where the commission and NV Energy decide how to recover the money that the utility spends and how much money the utility can recover. Because data centers are driving all of this infrastructure investment, they're adding to the rate base in a way that the historical test years, which the commission uses to set new rates, aren't necessarily catching. The Sierra Pacific Power rate case, which we're expecting in Q1 or Q2 of 2026, is an opportunity to look at some policy solutions, potentially like creating a new specific customer class for data centers or making sure that any costs allocated don't affect residential customers specifically. Residential customers, as we saw in that one graph earlier, are not the ones driving these incremental loads, driving these new additions to the system. And so making sure that we're not suffering the burden of these cost investments is going to be crucial. Lastly, we have the 2024 IRP's First Amendment and the 2026 full IRP. Integrated resource plans, or IRPs, are where the utility makes decisions about what to procure to serve their needed load. This is where those load forecasts happen, and then they also go out and procure the necessary generation to meet that load. We've already seen in the past few years the impacts of data centers, such as the retiring of Valmy, which was supposed to be replaced with clean energy, instead being converted to natural gas, locking Northern Nevada into more reliance on fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. These integrated resource plans are where assumptions about load and what it takes to meet that load are hashed out. And so we want to make sure that any data center load that is coming in will be met with clean energy and not necessarily needing new combustion turbines or other emitting resources. In the First Amendment to the 2024 IRP, NV Energy has said that they are only going to look for a 150 megawatt battery, which is really fantastic. But they have also indicated that in the next 6 months or so, we should see another full integrated resource plan. And that is where we would see an update to any assumptions, data center usage, load, and then presumably more generation that they plan to bring on between 2027 and 2029 to meet that. These are really technical and involved proceedings, but they also have consumer sessions where people can come out and say what they want to see and what they want NV Energy to be doing. And so then I'm going to pass it off to my colleague to also talk about another opportunity that we have at the PUCN.
Great. Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for joining the presentation this morning. So I'm George Cavros. I represent the organization at the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada, and I'm going to provide a really quick overview of the process NV Energy uses for interconnecting large abnormal risk projects to the grid. And by large abnormal risk projects, I mean projects that are exceptionally large, can come online quickly, can be highly speculative in some cases, and have unknown life cycles. And these projects will almost certainly demand upgrades to the grid. So what is the grid? The grid is made up of generation facilities. It's made up of transmission lines that can carry power long distances, and substations and smaller distribution lines that carry electricity to neighborhoods, homes, and businesses. So when a large customer asks for power that can't be served by the existing grid infrastructure, and the utility makes investments for grid updates, it incurs costs. And established regulatory policy is to generally assign those costs to customers who are causing those costs, not to other retail customers, which takes us to what's called Rule 9. So Rule 9 is a standardized generic tariff or framework that sets out how grid upgrade costs are allocated between the utility and the large customer. Generally, the tariff applies to distribution level investments, but it can reference other agreements that aim to protect other retail customers from costs related to transmission and generation upgrades as well. So The accuracy of NV Energy's electricity demand projections were hotly contested at the last resource plan approval process, where Emily and Deb have highlighted the company unveiled really staggering demand projections. And in its final order in that proceeding, the commission ordered a series of 4 workshops to be held by NV Energy to review its Rule 9 standardized tariff to make sure it's protective enough for customers given the new landscape that we're in today. So there were 4 workshops held this year. WRA participated, as did commission staff and the Bureau of Consumer Protection and others. And the issues focused on ensuring that there were sufficient protections for customers against cost shifts from large abnormal risk projects in the company's Rule 9 tariff. And this included asking questions like, are the contracts with high load customers of sufficient length, right? How long should customers be responsible for the costs incurred by the utility to serve them? Another question was, are there adequate security mechanisms for all the upfront utility investment? That's in the event, for instance, if the company, if the customer goes bankrupt. Another question was, are there stringent enough performance obligations on large abnormal risk projects? Because if the company builds new infrastructure to serve new large customers and the forecasted electricity load or demand from that customer doesn't materialize, then other customers are stuck paying for the stranded infrastructure costs. So one common theme that several stakeholders commented on was that the Rule 9 process lacked transparency because a lot of the performance obligation terms are being set through contracts between NV Energy and large customers outside of the Rule 9 tariff. And these contracts are not reviewed by the commission, and they can be amended, and they have been amended in the past without commission approval or oversight. So WRA would like to see more structure and more transparency in the Rule 9 tariff and process. At the end of the workshop process, NV Energy provided an update in August to the commission and stated that it possesses enough tools to protect its investment in serving large loads and that no structural changes are necessary at this time to its Rule 9 tariff. So with the conclusion of those 4 workshops at the moment, there is no forum at the commission to discuss and explore policies that can ensure that hardworking Nevadans' bills don't increase due to grid upgrade costs to serve large abnormal risk projects, including data centers. And it's also important to note that costs get harder to identify and quantify as you get further upstream from the distribution system into the transmission system and generation facilities. So this means that the commission should be looking at not only Rule 9 improvements, but also at rate design improvements to ensure that large customers are paying their fair share of transmission and generation upgrades. And we hope that the commission will continue to take a proactive role in this space because the stakes, as outlined here today for customers and the state, are really very high as we move forward. And I'll turn the presentation back over to my colleague, Deb.
Thanks, Emily and George, for that. So moving to the next slide, WRA put out a policy report this summer on data center water and energy use, as well as our recommended policy solutions for addressing those demands. And I'm just going to briefly go over some of the solutions that we highlighted. Emily discussed clean transition tariffs, which NV Energy does currently have a clean transition tariff, but we think that this is a really important policy for allowing customers that do have company sustainability goals to proactively be able to work with their utility to procure resources which fit those goals and advance clean energy in the state. Additionally, looking at behind the meter clean resource deployment. So looking at the existing regulations and potential statutory barriers that customers may face in deploying clean resources on the customer side of the meter. Given the fact that we want to ensure that this load is largely met with clean resources and that to the extent possible, there are not impacts on other ratepayers. Behind the meter clean resource deployment can be a tool for that. But I will note that in constructing a policy for this kind of resource deployment, it's really important to ensure that whatever services the customer is still utilizing from the grid are accurately accounted for. And this isn't a tool where the customer is underpaying for the services they are taking from the utility and thus having those costs subsidized by other customers. Another really key policy is load shifting, which is just moving times of electricity demand from these large customers. A lot of costs on the utility system are driven by peak demand or when electricity demand is highest. And so there are various policies like flexible interconnection that can allow for data centers and other large loads to reduce their load at times of peak demand to avoid some of those investments that would be needed if their loads were running at full capacity during those peak demand periods. Flexible interconnection is a really interesting policy here because it really is a hardware solution that allows for the utility and the customer to work together to curtail large amounts of load. And one thing that can be done is allowing, in exchange for flexible interconnection provisions from a customer, for the customer to kind of jump the line and come online earlier with the utility, which can be a very powerful motivator for data center developers to agree to perform load shifting. Additionally, looking at energy efficiency requirements that can be required of these facilities before they are built to ensure that they are using the most efficient possible designs in terms of airflow and things like that, so that they need less electricity usage if they are cooling their servers with electricity-based cooling technology, can be really helpful because once these facilities are built, it's much more difficult to implement energy efficiency best practices at that time. And then moving on to some consumer protection provisions, contract provisions between utilities and large loads are extremely important. These can be things like minimum contract terms, as well as reduction or termination of service charges to ensure that when infrastructure is built out for these customers that has a lifetime of 15, 20, 25 years, that the utility is actually able to recover those costs from that customer, and that if that customer chooses to terminate the contract or to use significantly less electricity than what they originally asked for from the utility, it is that customer that bears the financial risk of doing so, as opposed to the utility and potentially its captive existing ratepayers. Additionally, when it comes to rate making and economic development reform, WRA would like to note that many existing economic development rates are premised on this idea that really large loads that are siting in an electric utility service territory are driving economic development and job creation. And so given that co-benefit of economic development, it may be, from a public policy perspective, advantageous to offer those customers a discounted electricity rate. However, when it comes to data centers, they are driving very few permanent jobs. Most of the job creation from data center is actually temporary job creation for the actual construction of the facility. So re-examining economic development rates and what their intention is, and if the intention is to drive job creation, creating provisions in those economic development rates that explicitly tie the offering of economic development rates to metrics like tax revenue or job creation or other indicators of economic development, and not just continuing to operate on the blanket assumption that a large electric customer is spurring economic development. Additionally, when it comes to rate making, ensuring that these customers that have very unique characteristics of being extremely high load factor customers, that is operating at near their peak capacity around the clock with little flexibility and being so incredibly large, are accounted for in the rate making process and determining if it is appropriate to group them with other commercial and industrial customers, or if perhaps it is appropriate to put them in their own rate class based on those characteristics so that costs can be more accurately assigned to these different groups. So essentially, that's just saying that these customers have characteristics that differentiate them from another groups, and it is not intended to necessarily single out data centers or be something that is punitive. It just helps to have more groups that you can assign costs to if you are seeking to more accurately assign costs to groups with different characteristics. And then on the water side, water efficiency and reporting is a hugely lacking policy area. There is very little that is required from data center operators, both in terms of the water disclosures they have to make prior to the project being built, as well as ongoing water reporting once the project is built to see if they are following up with their projected water use or if they are exceeding it, which we have seen from other data centers. And so requiring water reporting that is publicly available and that looks at things like peak water demand, as well as water use overall, and the sources of water that are being used, including whether they are utilizing potable water, is a really important piece for transparency and future policymaking, as well as potentially requiring water efficiency measures from these data centers. So on the next slide, I am going to talk about legislation from other states. And this isn't intended to be an endorsement of these pieces of legislation, but rather to give an overview of how other state legislatures have looked at this issue. And all three pieces of legislation that I'm going to talk about passed in the 2025 session, which saw a proliferation of data center related bills across the country. And I'm specifically going to talk about these three states' legislation because they represent a really broad range of policy actions that states took on data centers. So on the next slide, I will move into Minnesota HF 16/SF 19. This was a special session bill. And one thing that I will note here is that the way that it defined data centers and their loads was that a data center had to be over 100 megawatts or more in order to fall under this bill's regulation. So regarding water use, Minnesota really gave a lot of authority to permitting to look at how water use was considered in the facility and making that permitting decision. So for data centers that anticipate using over 100 million gallons per year prior to a permit for the facility being issued, it is possible to require aquifer tests, and also evaluation of the project has to be based on whether technologies or measures to promote water conservation, the efficient use of water, and watershed health are reasonably considered. And also, they can look at the application and evaluate it based on whether it uses water efficient fixtures and practices, whether the facility recycles water before discharging, partners with local water utilities to use discharged water from the data center, uses reclaimed water, installs closed loop systems, or supports water restoration and replenishment in local watersheds. So this gave a really broad array of considerations to permitting decisions based on the data center's water use. And then moving to the electricity side of the bill, Minnesota, the legislature there actually explicitly created a large customer class through this legislation. And so the way they did that is they said that by the end of December of 2026, the Public Utilities Commission in Minnesota had to establish a definition with the appropriate characteristics of a very large customer class or subclass for these data center loads over 100 megawatts. And then following on that definition being established, they also required that in looking at tariffs or ESAs for those large customers, there were certain criteria the Public Utilities Commission had to consider. And so they had to consider whether the tariffs or ESAs helped achieve the quantitative benchmark of the state's statutory emissions reduction standards. And they also had to show whether the plan submitted by each investor-owned utility in the state to serve that additional load could occur without requesting a delay or modification in those statutory emission reduction standards, as well as whether the agreements between the utilities and the large customers had the necessary protections to ensure that other utility customers were not at risk for paying stranded asset costs. And then additionally, on the actual facilities themselves, the Minnesota bill had a list of different requirements of which data centers needed to meet one or more sustainable design or green building standards for the facility. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the Texas bill, SB6, which is a really interesting and unique approach. And I'll note that this applies to loads that are 75 megawatts and above. It was also passed by a supermajority and signed by the governor. So this was a bill that had a lot of bipartisan support. So first off, the bill requires a rulemaking to ensure that interconnection costs are appropriate and that large loads are paying an appropriate premium on their interconnection costs and that that's not being paid by other customers. And then the most interesting portion of this bill is this requirement for the use of backup generation for load curtailment purposes at the direction of the grid operator during grid emergencies. So for these data centers that have on-site backup generation, which data centers tend to do, they are required to curtail that load if needed. So ERCOT can tell these loads that they are required to essentially move to their backup generation instead of taking electricity from the grid. And so this is something that's really interesting because obviously while it does have huge public health and air quality implications to be deploying all of these diesel backup generators, it is a very interesting example of a state explicitly saying that data centers do have to have some flexibility in order to take service from a utility. And so that is like a very clear example of their being able to legislate that data centers don't necessarily get to have 100% of the electricity supplied by the utility whenever they want, and that they are subject to these conditions. Additionally, the Texas bill required additional financial commitments from large load customers if their presence on the system required additional transmission build out, and then provided a methodology for demonstrating site control to better improve the certainty of load forecasting on these customers. So really understanding at what point in the pipeline of a data center facility requesting service do they actually necessarily have control of that land, and how likely is it that the data center will actually come to fruition. So on the next slide, we'll discuss Oregon's legislation. And I'll note that they had a significantly lower threshold for these data center loads at 20 megawatts compared to 75 or 100. But of course, that's still an extremely large customer. And so Oregon actually explicitly in their legislation created a new rate class for these 20 megawatt plus data centers that is different from other industrial and commercial classes. And then furthermore, they went on to legislate various provisions that are applicable to that new class. So for example, there is a 10-year minimum contract term for utility service for all customers in that class. And then they left this a little more broad for the Utilities Commission to determine, but there must be a minimum amount or percentage that is paid in every month's bill for all customers taking service under that class, but that is to be determined by the Public Utilities Commission. And then furthermore, in evaluating any rate structure for this new class, the commission explicitly has to consider whether the rate structure impedes the state's clean energy goals. So again, the statutory emission reduction standards, as well as whether the costs of serving the class are represented and mitigate the risk of other classes having increased costs. So again, we see this customer protection aspect that is paired with a commitment to ensuring that these large loads do not delay or obstruct the ability of the state to meet the statutory emissions reductions goals. So hopefully that gives you a taste of what some other states have done in terms of legislation on this really hot topic of data center load. And we will move on to questions from the audience. So we have a question that I think I answered a bit of, which is, do any other states have separate rate classes for data centers already? So yes is the answer. So we saw in the Oregon and Minnesota legislation that the legislatures explicitly created new rate classes. We also have seen, not on that statewide level, but on a utility by utility level, the creation of new rate classes. So I think this is kind of a two-pronged approach where it can happen in a regulatory venue without explicit direction from the state legislature that a new rate class is created, or a state legislature can explicitly direct the Public Utilities Commission to create and define the appropriate characteristics of such a rate class. And I don't know, George or Emily, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in other utility rate cases, we've seen, like Deb said, the utility bring forward that new rate class. So this is something that NV Energy could theoretically pursue on their own as well. We have another question about if the Nevada Clean Transition Tariff is like able to be used right now. And the answer is yes, but no. The Clean Transition Tariff still has to be fully approved by the commission. They required that the utility model it one more time in an upcoming IRP application or amendment. There is an option for existing customers, though, to do the Nevada Green Energy Rider. That program is limited to 100 megawatts, though.
Great. I'm seeing a question come in that's asking about the difference between an IRP and an ESP and the opportunities to address load growth in each of those proceedings. George or Emily, do you want to take that?
Sure. So the IRP is where the load forecast is made, and then procurement decisions are made as well. The utility comes forward with a portfolio of resources that they think they need to meet that need, and then it is approved by the commission. The ESP, or Energy Supply Plan, is kind of like a yearly update of their progress towards reaching those IRPs. Normally, we are not able to hash out any further details. They can provide small updates, but they're not as legally binding, and you don't see any new resources being usually brought forward in ESPs. Everything that would go into the rate base or be approved by a commission or drive what the generation capacity that is being procured is coming from is going to be in the integrated resource plans. Those were supposed to be filed every 3 years, and then in the 2023 legislative session, NV Energy was able, or the legislation was changed, and NV Energy is now able to file an IRP more often if they deem so necessary. There are a few rulemakings and investigatory dockets to reform the IRP process, but that is why we could see a new full IRP in 2026 instead of 2027. If they think that they need a full update to the load forecast and they're no longer able to do that via the amendment process, we're going to see a full application.
Thanks for that, Emily. And we've got a lot of questions about rates, which is exciting. This one is, could the PUCN initiate a new rate class, or does it need to come from NVE?
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I mean, I could take a shot at that. It's really a very good question. So we had in the last rate case we were involved in, had recommended that the commission look at a separate rate class for high load customers above 25 megawatts. The commission in its final order kind of declined to address that recommendation. I will say that it's probably easier if it comes from the utility itself. After all, the tariffs and the rates are published and administered by the utility, but it is, you know, conceivable, certainly under the commission's sort of broad authority to set just and reasonable rates that they could initiate in a rate case or propose in a rate case a separate rate class on their own.
Great. And I'm seeing another question again about rates that wants to know if the load growth in the Sierra Pacific service territory, so the northern Nevada portion of NV's service territory, would mean that rates would likely be higher for those customers, but fewer increases would be seen in the south.
Yes, that is correct. Because NV Energy's two subsidiaries do operate financially separate, even though the system is dispatched as one, the rate cases occur for just one area. We did just have the NPC rate case, so the Southern Nevada subsidiary, and we brought up, like George said, kind of the idea of a larger data center or different kind of customer rate class there. But the fact that the system is dispatched as one is maybe going to lead to some increases in Southern Nevada because whatever resources are being brought in onto the system, new infrastructure, new CTs, anything like that could theoretically also be dispatched to aid in the serving of Southern Nevada. But predominantly since these are located in the north, we would expect that most financial leaching of any impacts would be in the north as well.
Great, thanks for responding to that, Emily. And then I think we have time for one last question. And I see a question here that is there any clue as to what generation the Nevada utility is going to build / contract to meet this exploding demand? And will nuclear be part of that?
I can also take this. So the utility is not in any form ever indicated that they had been or will be looking at nuclear. I think what we're going to see in terms of firm generating capacity is more enhanced geothermal. So not traditional geothermal, but the new projects that come from the likes of like Fervo in the case of this 115 megawatt project that is coming under the CTT. Most likely because this would add a lot of like base load, we would be seeing this being met with more fossil fuel resources, such as like those combustion turbines or combined cycle turbines. And additionally, because of the federal environment right now, we might not see as much solar or wind coming online. I do think we will see an uptick in storage as well, but presumably we're going to see more methane gas on the system. And then my guess is for the long-term enhanced geothermal for clean dispatchable. But most of this is also cost-based. So the utility in the IRPs procures what is as least cost as possible. And because, again, of that changing federal landscape, any diminishing tax credits like solar could make it not as economical and, again, have cascading effects on Nevada's impact or environment, I mean.
Yeah, great question, and thanks for answering that, Emily. We are unfortunately out of time to take another question and give it the answer that it deserves. So I'm sorry if we were unable to get to your question. And I would just note that at WRA, we really would love to be a resource on this topic and to answer questions as helpful. And we hope that you're able to refer to our materials on this topic, like our data center report and our Nevada fact sheet. And thank you so much for joining today. Have a great rest of your day.